and you are watching the Chessweep channel. By the way, this is not just a normal stream, this is the Saturday Chess Lab. In Saturday Chess Lab, we look through opening problems, opening questions for Twitch donators and Twitch subscribers. So, first off, already got some questions on Discord. Going to answer those. And if you're just wondering, in general, that's what we're going to look for. Right, so let's head on over to the first game. And let me answer and give you an explanation. So, the first question that was asked by Arjun is, Chessweep, could you go over a closed Breyer variation of the Caro-Kann? Also Hyperborax, maybe also a quick look at e4, c6, d3, d5, knight f3, which is very interesting. So, first off, e4, c6, d3. This is actually a rare system compared to the systems that we all know. The systems that we all see and love is d4, d5, this advanced variation, trying to press and kind of making black to be a little bit cramped because this bishop will have to waste some time to get out, and white actually crosses the demarcation line, which provides a slight bit of an advantage. Now, d3, actually I'm surprised myself. I thought that d3 is just a sort of a close King's Indian attack, but it's not so. It is actually the Breyer variation. I only knew that this line, d4, d5, f3, was the fantasy variation, but originally invented by none other than Maróczy himself, just bolstering the e4 pawn. But let's go back to d3, d5, knight d2. So this game that we're following at first is between Radjabov and Chaparinov. And Hyperborax asked, what about knight f3? What to do against knight f3? Now, this knight f3 move looks interesting, but in reality it's not so dangerous because it doesn't really have any threats. In fact, it's more of a provocation, which is true. In fact, Ilya said that there's so many lines equalizing, but that's a tricky thing. Whenever you have many options, it's very hard to decide which way to play and what to choose. Just imagine yourself in a supermarket. You can't quite decide, would you like this one, which is $2 cheaper, or get the other one, which is a bit more expensive, but will last longer? That's sort of a question. So, as Wakanda Forever just mentions in chat, can you just take on e4? Yes, but in fact, that is what white wants you to do. And this is the main point for the white system. Now, normally, you would have a pawn on e5 and enjoy your time as black, but you don't have that there. And you have a c6 move, which apart from stopping from your knight to go to c6, it doesn't really do anything good. And the main problem is the c8 bishop. Now, you can go bishop g4, but even if you do, it's very hard to get close to these pawns, and white will get the bishop there with kind of a risk-free position. White gets a risk-free position. So this is what white is banking on, that there's d-e, d-e, queen d1, king d1, and then this bishop is not so good, and this should just be slightly better for white. Therefore, I think there are many good solutions here, but you don't really have to take. And what I would advise is either bishop g4, the idea of h3 takes, e6, and you basically transpose to the Fischer variation, which is the following here, 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 and bishop g4. There's not much difference between the two. So this should provide ample play for black. But if you're not content with this one and you feel that this might be a little dicey, I think g6 is very interesting, or even, let's just call it interesting. But it does look really good. Note that a lot of times black even plays g6 when white has d4 in, but the pawn is just on d3 now. And this, in general, I think is kind of the system that you want to face. Just play g6, bishop g7, and hope for the best. Now, Arjun asked me to show it from a white perspective, and for that I came up with an idea, and I'm going to show that to you guys and dear viewers after this one. But all honestly, both sides have fair chances here when you're playing this variation. So who's better? I don't think anyone's really better here. I think it's mutual chances for both sides. So for that, let's start and take a look at this game. So knight d2, g6, probably it's going to transpose back, bishop g7, g3. Now, let's stop here just for a second and try to evaluate the position. What's going on and what is going on and what is good for black? What's kind of a problem for black? And why would you play this as white? Dear viewer and future viewer on YouTube. One thing is that I would mention is that this bishop is kind of strong on g7. It's not really obstructed by the knight, which is usually on f6 by now. But what else is there? That bishop is really menacing. On the other hand, this bishop on c8 is really bad. So that kind of equals out. You have a terrible piece compensated by a really good one. And also, who's going to have more space? That is my big question, and it's always very important to answer that question in chess. So Dortam, you're saying white has more space or less space? Well, not likely. In fact, no. The answer is no. Because once white decides to play this King's Indian setup, it means that there's so many squares to grab, mostly these squares, to grab for black. And if black manages to grab those squares, black will be better, just simply according to the rules of chess. e5, and in fact e5 is a strong move just because of that, grabbing more space and stopping white from ever playing d4. If d4 happens, that would activate this bishop on g7. On the other hand, e5 comes at a price, namely that the bishop is bad. On the other hand, it does support a central pawn, and this means that if nothing really will happen in this game, black will be better because he has more pawns in the center. So you want to gain space, but you also want to activate your pieces, Dortam. So if they play d4, probably you want to take because you want this bishop to be more active than not. Okay? Bishop g2, knight e7. The reason the knight goes to e7 is to keep this pawn protected by the bishop. Also, if anything opens up, this bishop will be ready to pounce. Castle, castle. So the next move is kind of interesting by Radjabov. Black is obviously preparing to expand with d4 and c5. How can I possibly stop this expansion without losing material, losing pawns or pieces? It's very important. You might want to stop your opponent's plans. It doesn't always happen. Wakanda, it doesn't work right now. How can Rajabov stop this c5 idea? c3? c3, I don't see how that stops c5. But b4, as Chad mentions, does stop that expansion. On the other hand, this move is a little loose. Also, this opens up, although it's kind of tough to blast through, as whenever you take, I take with the pawn, and this bishop is still just looking at that e5 pawn over there. But there's one problem with this move. Namely, that it's a lone pawn move not supported by all the other pawns. So b4, in fact, might be a little bit inaccurate, and Cheparinov, who was the second of the world champion Veselin Topalov, finds a very good little break here. So note as black, and I'm even going to flip the board for this game, you want to play c5 eventually, but you can't because this b pawn is annoying. So how can you play against that b pawn? a5, of course. So a5 is really strong now for a simple but important reason. Usually you want to play a3 to support the pawn, but it doesn't really work this time because I can take and you can't really capture back because your rook is hanging and you're not quite ready to do so because it's not defended. Now, Fireball is asking why not knight b3 instead? Well, your knight is not really well placed here. Might be an interesting idea, stopping that move. So far, it's not as popular. People usually either play b4 or something else. And also, you usually want your knight, and you want it towards the king side. But talking about unusual moves, sometimes unusual moves are really good. So I don't know, might be an idea for a future game. So if I were you, I might try it. So b4. Alpha, you're saying Kia was meant for kingside play? Not really. It's just saying, and it only means king's Indian attack. a5, and a5 is a strong move because you can go a3, and that means you're going to lose the fight over these important squares. ba, queen takes a5, bishop b2. So this e5 pawn is a little weak. And if we notice that that pawn might be a potential target, how can we potentially defend it? Note, whenever you start following a plan, stick to it. That's very important in chess. Yep, d4. And in fact, this is good for multiple reasons. What could be those reasons why this d4 move is so good? It's a strong move and an important one. So the idea is A, to gain space, yes, Zeus and Dortam, but most importantly, You're just turn this bishop into a pawn. It's firing at the wall. It really is useless at the moment. Knight b3, queen c7, c3. So no wonder that Radjabov is trying to undermine it as quickly as possible. On the other hand, this will be at a cost. dc, bishop takes c3. And if you're a fan of the fantasy variation, you know which move to play here. c5. As in fact, the fantasy variation of the Caro-Kann is named and should have been named after Maroczy, and this is a typical Maroczy plan. You are making sure there's no d4 break, and then, if that never happens, there is just a backwards pawn on d3, and black is just clearly better now. So yes, this King's Indian attack structure is playable for white, but if black knows what she is doing, you can eventually just get better without really trying too hard. Let's continue. Knight d2, b5. Note that Cheparinov is taking away this important c4 square, also stops any a4 breaks. And because of that backward d-pawn, white is just suffering here. Queen c2, knight a6. Puts the knight on a6 because he wants to put the other knight on this square. And also this protects the c5 pawn. Rook c1, bishop e6. Knight f1, knight c6. So whenever I look at this position, and I unfortunately face this as white, and I can tell you this is very painful. Why? Because A, you don't really have an attack as white. Also, you just have way too many weaknesses. These pawns are weak. They'll be easily attacked. Knight b4 is coming, and there's so many important juicy squares that black can use. So in positional means, white is just busted. Knight d3, c4. So Cheparinov makes sure that before this knight could arrive to d5, he plays c4, dc, bc, knight d5. But knight d5 is losing because you lose too much material. And if you go knight d2, black just goes knight b4, gets all the rooks on the files, might even plunk a knight on d3, and this is just misery. Miserable for white. Mr. Lilies, thank you for following. So here, Radjabov just collapsed, played knight d5, takes, knight d4. This knight isn't escaping. Or if it does, then that c2 pawn remains on the board. This pawn is just too strong. Takes, knight c6. This is falling. Knight takes, and this. You take here, take on b6, and it's over. Now, this was an example how bad things could get, but it doesn't really have to be this bad. So, let's add add a new chapter, Caro-Kann 2. Okay. And here's a potential improvement that I suggest for white. So same thing. Again, I repeat, knight d2. If knight f3, you can go bishop g4 or just go g6. I think you can just go g6, and actually this transposes back to the line that we're looking at right now. Hello, Fortuna Chess Coach. Thank you so much. So, now we go back to this line. Familiar much? Yes, it is. So, white actually decides to eschew b4, as decided that a5 is just annoying. But how else can we attack that e5 pawn? That's a big question. So what Fedoseev said, who's a strong up-and-coming super GM, played b3, saying, okay, a5 is not as dangerous because you're not attacking my b4 pawn, and I can potentially go bishop b2 and attack that e5 pawn. And again, this is sort of a King's Indian attack type of position. Is white better? It's kind of hard being better here because you don't have that much space. But is it playable? Can you win a chess game? Sure you can. So a5. If our opponent plays a5, what could be the idea behind this sneaky little move? The idea behind this sneaky little move that a4 is going to happen. Now as white, are we big fans of that? I don't hear you, chat. We are not a big fan of a4 happening, so we're going to play a4 ourselves. Just stopping that plan, and we still want to put some pressure on this e5 pawn. Bishop e6, rook e1, again, putting pressure, d4. Now, this sort of going to turn into a King's Indian attack type of position. Now the question is, once Motilyov, who's black, and is a famous grandmaster, played d4, which moves could we consider now that we wouldn't consider before? You don't see a problem with a4, but a4 is coming sooner or later, Fireball. That's the reason Fedoseev made sure, okay, I just don't want to see a4 happening. So if we're playing this position, what would be your first thought, chat? f4 now is illegal, Wakanda. Let me try, but it is illegal, I'm sure. This is illegal. See? It's illegal. So with rook e1, you're trying to put pressure on the e5 pawn. Maybe bishop a3, but bishop a3 was possible a move ago. But what actually you want to do is attack this e5 pawn. Also, if you get this bishop to b2, as we've seen in the previous game, that bishop would be biting granite. And that's what we don't want. We don't want that to happen. Rook e1, d4. So naturally, we're not going to move the bishop anymore because it will support a potential f4 break. So knight c4, putting pressure. And also, look, sometimes if you play well, you get rewarded. Your e4 move was so good, it's rewarded because now this a5 pawn is fixed and can't really run away from this potential bishop d2, knight e5 plans. So it will be a potential target all along the way. Bishop c4, b takes c4, c5. And there's something interesting about this game of chess. So what can we say about, in general, the c8 bishop? Is it a good bishop? Is it a good bishop in general? Do we like that c8 bishop? Not really. In fact, we just want to get rid of it sometimes. But the truth is, even though sometimes your bishop is misplaced and we consider it bad, whenever you exchange it off, it will leave off something. And namely, the white squares now will become extremely weak. And you'll see it'll be missing. So BC, C5. Now, how can we activate this bishop while also setting up some attacking prospects? That's actually a very important move here in this position. Because this bishop at the moment is just staring at the wall, not doing too much. So bishop h3 is a good first start, yes, but try to build on this first idea of bishop h3. Yes, bishop h3 is logical, but it's not too aggressive. It just improves the bishop just a little bit. Go here. The bishop gets a bit improved, but that's about it. How can you combine attacking ideas and activating the bishop? Set up for f4 break. Now that's interesting, Zeus, but how does that connect to that bishop on g2? Okay. So yes, sometimes you can go ahead and play for f4, but obviously black is not going to take on f4 because why would she open your bishop up? So therefore, Fedoseev played this move h4. Now, he might go and play bishop h3 and then activate the bishop. And there's a significant difference between playing this move or h4. Why? Because here, you are only condemned to play for f4, let's say some knight maneuver and then f4. But after you played h4, you have multiple options. You can put this bishop here and still play for h5. Or change plans and go for f4. Yes, Mr. Iyesh. h6, knight h2. So h6 is basically a response trying to avoid h5. Now, again, here, let's say knight h4, knight d7, f4. That can, let's say, just play f6. And what I'm showing you here is Motilev doesn't have to react to your f4 at all. You can say, okay, whatever you want. And whenever you push, if you push, then this bishop is dead. If you take, I'm going to capture, and your bishop is still just staring at the wall. So f4 by in itself doesn't always solve the problem. So h4 actually gives you options of playing for something else other than f4. Also using the fact that Motilev is already missing this c8 bishop. h6, knight h2, and now once Motilev weakened his structure with h6, he's playing for f4. Knight c6, f4. And that's actually a big difference. Because if this pawn will ever be pushed on g5, there'll be weaknesses everywhere on the white squares. f5, and again, if we understand that the way to win this position for white is to aggressively open up the white squares, you'll find the next move. Remember, you want to weaken these squares. So I see ef, knight f3. Knight f3 I don't really understand. But ef I of course do, because it would open up the bishop. On the other hand, we do have weaknesses ourselves, and this bishop is still very passive. So yes, we want to open up, but this would activate this knight. which is kind of passive on e7 at the moment. Indeed, h5. Why is this better than ef? Because I'm making progress without helping your development or your plan. Queen d6, h takes, queen takes g6. And it seems that there's some threats here. And if you take on f5, I take, and I have even more pressure on the g pawn. But Fedoseev comes up with a very nice little move. A bit of a Zug here. This does look scary, Zeus, but Fedoseev's next move is A+. Again, classically, you're going to want to use the fact that you have white square domination. And move is G4. Point being, whichever way you take, I'm gonna play F5, closing up the position. If you sacrifice, I just have enough people around to defend myself. Once you move your queen, I take on G4. So now you might ask me, okay, Dennis, fine. You've been trying to open up the white squares. You told us to open it up with h5, g4, and then you just played f5 and kept your bishop closed in. What was going on? What's the point of this? The point is the following. Yes, why kept the position closed? But this bishop can slalom to h5 and put pressure later on, because the nature of the position is more of a closed system, not an open one. So you have lots of time to activate this bishop, which you didn't have in the other position because your bishop just didn't have any prospects. Now the situation has changed a lot because this bishop will get to h5 sooner or later, and if it gets there, it's just going to cause devastation. Note again that there's no black squared bishop that could be used as a counter argument and something that you could use against it. But let's see what happens. h5. This is already sort of a desperation, and Motilyov is aggressively trying to press Fedoseev back from these juicy squares on h5. Queen h3, bishop h6. Now bishop h6, even if it's not the best, it's quite a clever move. Why? Because white had the bishop bare, and if this bishop would have activated on c1, then black would have been in huge trouble. So Motilyov says, okay, I'm willing to give up pawns, whatever, or what have you, just please exchange up this bishop. Bishop f3. And bishop f3 is a smooth little move. Why? Because whenever you're attacking, and it's kind of clear, as we have way more pieces on the king side, attacking, you don't really want to force exchanges, because the person with less space is the one who should strive for exchanging stuff. Therefore, he says, okay, if you want to exchange, go ahead. That's your business. I'm going to activate this terrible bishop and move it to f3 and then to h5. Knight b4, rook e2. Defending and also planning this maneuver. King h8, bishop takes h5. Rook g8, knight g4. And suddenly you can see that this king is under heavy fire. Bishop e3 takes, king h1, and it's sort of an agony because black can really bring another rook here when actually white would be in trouble. But black is kind of condemned of waiting for white to just move on up against this king and win the game effortlessly. Rook g5, rook h2, not bothering to take because that pawn is going to fall eventually. Knight takes e5. The point being, if you take here, I have knight f7 check, and we'll take there. I check, take here, and you're just going to get mated. Note that you don't have enough people around to defend. takes, knight d5, rook f8, just trying to defend against that, bishop d1, which is kind of sweet. The idea is the following: if you take, you got checked, and this knight is falling. And after that, the game was basically over. Why can't black capture the knight? What? Which knight? So you can't capture on c2 because rook h5 and you lose. I mean, even then you don't lose because of rook h2 counterpin. But this is not a necessary complication that Fedoseev needs to get in. What about knight f6? Well, if knight f6, black just plays queen h6, and you don't have any other way to move forward just by going, you can just only go back. Therefore takes, bishop d1, and after this, the game was basically over as Fedoseev won the piece. So what we learned from this game, and if you like to play this, and I fast forward back to the opening, instead of b4, you can play this b3 system and just play the same way Fedoseev did, and probably you get an interesting fighting position. Will you get an advantage? It depends, because there's so many variables that we don't know. Black has multiple ways of defending and attacking. So I think, in general, I would advise to follow this Fedoseev Motilev game if you like this. With white, Arjun, that this one is for you. Answering your question and Hyperborax's question. But in general, I don't think that this would mean it's unplayable for black. It's chances for both sides. It is playable for black as well, especially as black has so many pawns in the center. And again, just to point out, with knight f3, I think g6 is just fine, kind of transposing into the line that we were just looking at. So this is the Caro-Kann section that I wanted to answer. Other questions. So let me answer a question by Mega Blaziken that was asked me on Discord. That's not an opening, Fireball. That's not an opening. So, this is question number 2 by Mega Blaziken. The Dutch variation. Okay, create chapter. So, okay, d4, f5, knight f3, knight f6, and then I'm going to read what Mega Blaziken is asking. Here, a3, up, e5, promote, delete, de, e4. Okay. So this is the position supposed to have equalized for white, but it doesn't feel that way. Gives the example. So where do I deviate? Do I play this queen e5, e5 system, knight c6, or f5 in general? What do I give as an option? Or so the line that he was giving is here, fe, here, takes, and this feels to be better for white according to Mega Blaziken. So first off, I'm going to flip the board. Whenever you play the Dutch, you can't really count on equality. What you can count on is counterplay, at best. So if you actually end up being worse, well, you played the Dutch. And it's not really, my way of saying that, this is horrible. It is just objectively not good. Why? Well, one of the weakest square in chess is the f7 square. Can be easily targeted. Also, black can often get checked and get into some double attacking stuff, which is annoying. Also, you're losing a pawn and you're not having this pawn. I mean, you're not losing the f pawn per se, but you're losing it as form of a defender. You just don't have that pawn there as a defense. Here, castle, d6, queen e8, a3. Now, one of the things that I think some people forget that sometimes you do have to know more than one variation. And that is especially true when you have some variations that are a little bit dubious. So the Dutch is a little bit dubious. a3, and to be honest with you, I don't think a3 should be that good. I think rook e1 is the big test with e4 breaks, and that can be a problem. Now a3 I think is not such a good move. In fact, I think is just inaccurate because it does absolutely nothing. And if you think about this, if your opponent's move makes absolutely no sense, you don't have to immediately punish it. You can just improve your own position, Mega Blaziken. So you're saying e5 because that seems like the most and sharpest way of playing, but you don't need to do that. Why not just go c6? And you might say, oh, c6 with queen e8. But yes, there is a variation like this. You can mix the two. So let's say they play d5, so they can stop this e5. Because if b4, then you can go e5, and no longer there is this knight d5 move. So d5, just stopping e5 break. Bishop d7, just over defending. Knight a6, and knight c7, and then with e5 played. And honestly, this is a great position in general. And this is a typical position in the Dutch fireball. Take a look at that. You have to work for getting that Dutch knowledge. Knight c6 is also a way of playing, but c6 is a totally different concept. What you're playing for here is the following. You go knight c7, queen b3, cd, cd, queen f7. And black is going to put pressure on the d5 pawn. And sometimes if this knight moves, you even consider knight b5. Obviously not right now. But if rook d1, again, sometimes you can play knight e4, activating the bishop, putting pressure here and on the f2 pawn. So definitely I think you need to know more than one line in the Dutch if you want to be very successful. Queen e8, e5 might be a little bit dodgy. I still am going to show one line that I feel should be okay for black. But all honestly, I think c6 would be the best. And also to answer you, Fireball, the reason black plays c6 is to limit the scope of the g2 bishop. Whenever you play knight c6, you don't really limit this bishop at all. You're just facilitating e5 breaks. With c6, you make sure that this bishop is just having a bad time. And this should be decent for black. Maybe even more than decent, Mega Blaziken. But to answer your question with e5, takes e4, knight c6, knight d5, fe, knight g5. I think queen d8 is better. You don't really want to create a strong d5 pawn there. Because if you take, there's just easy targets on c7, which can become annoying. So instead, queen d8, I think is better. And if takes, queen takes, knight d4, queen f5. Point is, you're going to plonk a knight on d4 and just get some active play with bishop e6 or bishop d7 and bringing the rook in the game. Now, maybe this is objectively not equal, and you might not like that. But then you don't like the Dutch variation in general. You might not get equality, but you might get some counterplay. And that's the give and take, but you have to decide what variations you're willing to do and play in chess. You play the Dutch, that could be a reason. And what I'm really saying here is that yes, you can play this way. This can be comfortable if you're comfortable with the Dutch in general, or play the c6 system and know a couple of other systems, and you can combine those. And in fact, to be honest with you, I kind of prefer c6 here, go bishop d7, knight c7, and then go for e5 breaks. That's something that I think would make sense. Mega Blaziken, sure thing. Thank you for joining in and hope you'll have a good time rewatching if you have the chance. So I think c6 is a better way of, going against this a3 line. Or if you play the e5 line, you've got to be content with an isolated pawn. The one that I just showed. You've got to be content with this one. And maybe you're not even that much worse, but it still can be uncomfortable if white plays it really well. Fireball is asking a question. What's the difference between the Perth, the Modern, and the King's Indian? Perth and the Kid. So, as far as I know, this is the modern way of playing. The difference is white gets to play knight c3 here and play the Austrian attack. What are the benefits for white? Well, there are not as many pawns in the center that black could attack, only the d4 pawn. And this often leads to wild play where black really needs to be accurate. Compared to this variation, which is the King's Indian, white already committed with c4, so there's already 2 pawns in the center, and the third is coming. d6. And the thing is, you no longer can over-defend the d4 pawn. So black will have lots of ways to undermine this d4 square and pawn on that square. Note this to this one. Here, white could even decide to play c3, just bolster this structure, and you will never ever be able to undermine that d4 pawn. That's the issue here. You can't do that. So that's basically the main difference. And the other difference is that this comes solely from this system. So once you decided to play d4, c4, you can only play the King's Indian. So you can transpose back to the modern and Perk. Here, knight c3, d6, here, or f4. f4 is probably the most critical. White actually is not forced to go this way and can play c4 here if it wants to play a King's Indian. So in fact, white has a choice in this case. So no wonder a lot of times black plays d6 first, here knight f6, and this is the perk, forcing white to play knight c3, g6, and then we have the perk. Because if you do it in any other move order, white can transpose back to the king's Indian. And some people wouldn't want that. What would I play? It depends actually what you mean by that, Zeus. Do you mean white or black? And it also kind of depends on style. Some people just enjoy playing this with white. They enjoy playing against the king's Indian. And some people just think that, okay, in general, I'm just happier to play this Austrian attack with f4. I just did fireball. Would you transpose to the king's Indian or the Austrian attack? So according to modern theory, this is dangerous for black. So this is what I have as an answer. I've got a question from Wakanda. Wakanda's French will be next. Wakanda's French. And for that, I prepared a little bit of a game played by none other than Mr. Fabiano Caruana. And what they asked me, and what Wakanda asked me, was the following. I want an aggressive system and make it that it's not the Tarrasch. Okay, e4. So I was thinking maybe you could try e5, check out some Shirov games, which could be interesting, but is a little tedious at times. So I thought, knight c3, which is the sharpest by far. Definitely the sharpest way of playing, and it's definitely an opening, I think, is worth looking at and trying out. Bishop b4, this is the main line. And for knight f6, I definitely advise you to play it this way, and knight f3, bishop e3. Bishop b4, e5. This is an important move. Again, you're making sure nothing lets this bishop out, so it has to go this way, which is time consuming, as we shall see in this game. Sure thing, Wakanda. c5, a3, takes, queen a5, queen a4. So what Lenderman is preparing here is b6 and bishop a6. But if we channel aggressive play in these type of positions, we need to go more aggressive, and that is queen g4. So Wakanda, one of the things and the reasons I kind of advise you to play this way is this is an aggressive way of playing. Yes, you have pawn weaknesses, but in return you have the bishop there, and you have good chances of breaking through and checkmating your opponent, as surprisingly happens. King f8. So, if we know that we're supposed to play aggressively, how would you continue here, dear Wakanda and viewers? So far, we have put pressure on that g-pawn. But can a queen by itself win a game? Checkmate. No, it can't. So h4, yes, Wakanda. You already have the feel for this. h4. So not only you threaten h5, but there is a beautiful maneuver here that's well worth remembering, and that is this rook h3 maneuver, getting the rook over to put pressure on the g7 pawn. Now, always tread carefully with that move because it can get misplaced there, but it's an idea to keep in mind. Knight c6, h5. Threatening h6. So Lenderman decides to stop it himself. Now, there is a typical move here that I'm going to show. This is Queen D1. This is a very strong move. A strong but typical move. Why? Well, the queen actually did its job. Attack the g7 pawn, force the king to defend it, therefore black cannot castle anymore. And now, it no longer needs to be on g4. Also note, if you play rook a2, there's a sneaky little tactical idea here, namely knight takes e5. Something you don't want to miss. You can't take because your queen is undefended. That is kind of the reason they play queen d1 instead. And now Lenderman really should have played b6, bishop a6, and played that way. But Lenderman took the pawn. Knight f3, gambiting some more. bc, bishop c3. The big question is, though, Lenderman played something else. But what if Lenderman would have played knight e7? What's wrong with this move? What's the problem with knight e7? It's white to move and win. Very pretty one, too. Rook h4, indeed, which is very pretty. You don't expect a long-range move to trap a queen. In fact, it is trapped. It can't go anywhere. All those squares are protected. So you can see that this system is actually very dangerous because you have the bishop pair and black is so much lagging in development. So in general, this is a line well worth playing. But okay, Lenderman played g5, h takes. g5 was actually against this maneuver. Queen e4 check, bishop e2. You don't really want to exchange queens in these positions. Because yes, you have the bishop pair, but it's worth much less if you don't have attacking chances. Bishop e2. Queen takes g6. Queen d2. So I wonder, what is queen d2 preparing? Actually preparing long castles. Which might look strange, but black is way too behind to actually put pressure on this king on c1, and this king is under heavy fire already. Knight e7, bishop d3, queen g2, and seemingly all is hopeless for Caruana. But Bobby has something up his sleeve. Well, you always have to tend for both of those guys. So king e2. Very nice little move, defending both the rook and the knight on f3. Also, the hunter is getting hunted suddenly. And black is still few moves away from developing. Queen g4, rook h4, rook g1, just putting pressure. And note that those bishops are doing some fine business over on the king side. Rook f4, another very nice move by Fabiano. Because if you take, I take, and guess what? Your queen is trapped 2.0, which is kind of nice. So knight e7, just trying to defend it. Now, so we can tell that this knight can't really move because we'll take and it would turn into 3.0. So if your opponent is pinned, you should take a look at that and try to find another pin. Bishop b4, indeed. The more you can pin them, the better. I see some questions there. Why not rook takes h6? The answer is the following. Obviously, there are many ways of playing a chess game. Now, the way Fabiano plays is more with a concept. So he says, okay, I'm not just going to take a pawn and think afterwards. He's going for, okay, I'm going to go king e2 and bring my rook into the game. And see, you can already see all of Fabiano's pieces playing. This knight has the function of defending that e5 pawn. And just notice that in general, Fabiano is playing for his concept and not just taking pawns. Okay, so king e8 would be interesting, but then there's bishop b5 check, a5, and a5 sadly runs into an idea. And why is a5 a big problem here? Of course, there is this big boom on the board. Rook takes g6, and it's over. Because you can't take, you're pinned. You can't take with the lady, but then you'll be down. A queen, and the mate is imminent. So I heard some questions here that, oh, okay, so you showed that knight e5 is an idea. Why isn't knight e5 idea here? Well, namely, I can play queen g3 and have queen d6. And once the knight moves, you can take on c5. Also, apart from queen d6 and dc, there's h6. And the big difference is black didn't commit with h6 yet. And if one manages to get h6 in, then this king structure will be terrible. And that's why knight takes e5 is not so good. That's why Lenderman plays h6. And the big difference is, if Lenderman were to take and go back, there's no more h6 ideas for Fabiano Caruana. And then we get into this position. And again, one side note that I wanted to mention about this one is the following. Now, white has the bishop pair. Yes, white is down a pawn, but it's not really a big problem. Because this king is stuck in the middle, and you have lots of active piece play. So if you're playing this system, you really don't have to feel too bad about yourself. And as you've seen, it is kind of easy to win this game. To be honest with you, most of Fabiano's moves are rather straightforward. And I feel that should be good enough to explain how things were going. So Wakanda, did this help you decide and enjoy this knight c3 system. How do you like this knight c3 system so far? Hello there, Lolly. Those are super dangerous. I completely agree. And this was the game. Fabiano Caruana Lenderman. And these were the questions that I've got asked. And I really hoped that you guys enjoyed this round of Chess Lab. Hopefully, we'll have that in the future as well. This will be it for today. Thank you for listening. I hope I answered those questions that were asked. And now, let's give warm welcome to JT. With that, I say bye bye and hope you had a good time and you learned something about the openings and opening questions in general. Take care. Bye.